Hi, this is Scott Bradfield, and this is well into the 24th, 25th episode of Reading Great Books in the Bathtub. We've spent the past 18 to 20 episodes reading Ulysses in the bathtub. We have used up a small pond or a small tarn worth of water on our bathtub reading for this book, and I'm getting more and more cheerful as I get closer to the end of the book. Even though there are parts of it I still like, I find most of these later chapters, as I've said, pretty annoying. Okay, we're in a very long chapter here. I believe, as I recall, Joyce loved this chapter the most of all the chapters in the book. And as we've talked in the past, each chapter has a different narrative formula or a different way of telling a story. And this one is like a catechism or a question and answer or a logical presentation, or what do they call a syllogism, where you're asking a series of questions to get answers. So it's basically a series of questions and then answers. The material, the information, is not made story-like. It's basically information. It's strings of data, it's strings of lists of types of furniture in the room, it's dates in which things happened, and it's the things people said in expository terms. So there's no dialogue. There's none of the dramatic narrative techniques we talked about in the first few chapters. And he can tell a story this way. And as most of these chapters is true of all these late chapters, it works pretty well for a while, and then it goes on too long. So we start on page 776 with this penultimate chapter, and it is, remember, the whole book. The entire day of Ulysses is really one man, Bloom, going out into the world and coming home again. Okay, that's the sort of the to there and back again, like in The Hobbit. The going away and returning home changed to some degree. So we've taken this big epic idea of the journey and we've turned it into a human one of one man. We start the chapter with a simple question. And again, they're very direct. They almost mathematical questions or logical questions. What parallel courses did Bloom and Stephen follow returning home to Bloom's house? And for example, that first section really sets you up for the chapter. It's simply the streets that they crossed and how they got home, with a sort of mathematical formula laid on at the end, which I won't go into. The second question is, of what did the duumvirate deliberate during their itinerary? So now the dialogue that was sort of going along in the previous chapter is laid in as information. Music, literature, Ireland, Dublin, Paris, friendship, etc. There's a second paragraph which talks about what did they agree on. Both preferred a continental to an insular manner of life, a cisatlantic to a transatlantic place of residence. So if there's any sort of theme to the book, it is that they both these characters, like Joyce, preferred going into the world and getting involved in the mess of the world and not being locked up in your own little provincial world, such as Dublin, which Joyce was happy to get out of as a young man. So there's a I won't go into all these, but the chapters, the little sections, become questions of importance in very, very factual ways. Page 778. Had Bloom discussed similar subjects during nocturnal perambulations in the past? And then again, you have a paragraph in which dates of significant walks with friends for Bloom occurred in the past. Some of those names will show up again and again in the book as part of this kind of full life of Bloom and all the people he once knew and Molly once knew. It becomes just a matter of data. We want to go further. When they get home, about 781, Bloom has lost his key. The joke of the key and the house of keys. Stephen doesn't have his key. Blah blah. he has to climb up to get an extra key, I believe. He has to climb up somewhere anyway. And he gets back in there. Then they get inside, and Bloom washes his hands. The first thing he does is on page 783. He washes his hands with that lemon-scented soap he's been carrying in his pocket for the past several chapters. And it's brought to our attention that Bloom likes water, just water, bath water, taking baths. And what he finds in it is universality, its democratic equality and constancy to its nature in seeking its own level. And that humanistic quality of Bloom is well exemplified by that affection for water, in the same way that Stephen on the next page declines the offer of using the soap to wash his hands, and it's because he's a hydrophobe, hating partial contact by immersion or total by submersion in cold water. And that insularity and that closed offness and that intellectual pride of Stephen is another metaphor for the use of this difference in water. All right, so again, the next page, the one thing that Bloom notices about Stephen at this point is his confidence in himself, something that isolates Stephen and which at the same time Bloom sort of admires, because he's not very confident in himself. So then we go through lots of chapters. This is a long chapter, 100 pages, probably the second longest chapter of the book. Bloom makes him some hot chocolate. We get lots of details about what's in the house, what poems Bloom wrote in the past. There's a long section on the books that they have, that Bloom has in the house. At one point, the questioner of this catechism on page 798 asks, what two temperaments did they individually represent? The scientific, Bloom; the artistic, Stephen. And that also makes good sense as far as these two characters. We have a description of the death of Bloom's father again, the suicide of his father. It's mentioned in one of the questions. We have the offer. Bloom offers Stephen a night that he could stay the night. And Stephen says, no thanks. He doesn't want to stay there, and he goes off by himself. So we have a long passage where Bloom takes Stephen to the door, and they stand outside and they look at the stars before Stephen walks off. Again, these are really emotional narrative moments that Joyce takes us 800 pages to and basically just delivers us to information. It has an argument in it. It's not satisfying for a reader, but it has a sort of intellectual argument that appealed to Joyce, and I won't bother you with that argument. So the constellations and how they're changing as they look up, and then they both, on page 825, they stand there and they pee together, they urinate into the darkness together. And they leave each other, and Bloom goes back into the house and looks at the arrangements of furniture. Molly's moving the furniture around all the time. She doesn't like things to be the same. That's Bloom's. That's Joyce's vision of Molly. She doesn't like this consistency in life, and she likes to move things around. Which causes Bloom to continually bang his head on things. And he goes back into the house and he takes that Agendath Netayim. Remember the flyer early in the book about kind of a Jewish or a Zionist paradise, as I recall. I can't remember now, but it was, you could contribute money to this ambition to create a utopian society somewhere in nature, and Bloom folds it up and burns it, suggesting in that action that he is home. He's returned to a place that is his paradise in all its fault and inglorious qualities. We have a long section of the books that matter to Bloom. Astronomy has come up again and again, and some history books, and it reflects on page 834, when he's looking at all the books on the shelves, the notion that Bloom needs order in his life. He doesn't like these books being disorganized by Molly and coming and moving the books around, moving the furniture around. Sorry, I've got an annoying quality there. Okay, that's sorted. There's a whole section here, page 835. He's sitting and he's uncomfortable. It describes why he's uncomfortable. 836, again, how much money did he spend during the day? And there's an itemized account for Bloom's spending during the day, of Bloom's day. And the notion that he loves rectitude, he likes being good, that things are done right. And then he goes to bed. As it goes on, this is a long section. This is really where this is where the chapter starts to lose it. He starts going over the memory of the day and the papers describing the funeral earlier that day. And on page 862, he goes into bed with Molly, who's asleep, it seems. And what he finds in the bed is interesting. 862. As he climbs into the bed, what did his limbs, when gradually extended, encounter? And here's the answer. New, clean bed linen, additional odors, the presence of a human form, female, hers, the imprint of a human form, male, not his, some crumbs, some flakes of potted meat, recooked, which he removed. So he comes in, there's almost a narrative moment where he comes in, he sees the body, he recognizes it's female, he knows it's Molly, then he sees the impression, he realizes it's not his own impression, and then he sees the flakes of potted meat. They've eaten the plum tree's potted meat, the whole sexual joke that runs through the book, and Bloom wipes it away. And this is, of course, the record of the sex between Molly and Blazes Boylan, who'd come in earlier. So we have lists of people she's slept with, I believe, at the next one. He thinks about getting back at her on page 86. And the question is simple. What retribution, if any? So this question is asked. What is he going to do to get back at her? Assassination? Never. As two wrongs did not make one right. Duel by combat? No. Divorce? Not now. And the notion that he's angry and he wants to get back at Molly, but at the end decides no, there's nothing he can do about it, and he'll leave things as they are. That's really it. We have her wake up. There's a section here which is a little confusing every time I read it, in which Bloom recounts his day and describes to Molly what he's been doing all day and where he's been. And they'll be giving us, for example, detailed compass points of where Bloom is sitting when Molly looks at him and where she's sitting on page 870. But basically what it tells us is that he sits down to explain to Molly what his day was like and make excuses about why he came home late. And then he goes to sleep. And he tells Molly he wants breakfast in bed. This is his big he's always making the breakfast, right? He decides he wants breakfast in bed. He tells us to Molly. And that closes off Bloom from the book. The last chapter will be Molly in the final chapter of Ulysses, which we'll read next, in which she's thinking and gets up in the middle in the night and is her thoughts after Bloom returns home. Okay, that's probably the best. That's one of the best chapters in the book. And this one's long. There's some very good stuff in it. And it should be, instead of 100 pages, it should have been maybe 35. It would have been a really powerful chapter. All right, see you soon, and we'll be finishing this, and I think we should have confetti and probably fireworks and maybe a large bottle of bourbon. And you bring the bourbon, I'll bring the fireworks, and we'll close off one of the most challenging and interesting and frustrating books in English. Okay? Bye.